From the Institute for Research on Public Policy, this is Futureproofing Canada. I'm your host, Jennifer Ditchburn, President and CEO of the IRPP. I want to thank BMO Financial Group, our presenting sponsor, for its generous support of this podcast. One of the best things about my job is that I get to hang out with some of the smartest people in Canada, hear about their research, their ideas, their solutions. I had a chance to participate in one such workshop assembled by Professor Alex Marland at Acadia University in Nova Scotia. Alex holds the Jaroslavsky Chair in Trust and Political Leadership and is also an IRPP board member. He assembled a group of scholars and experts in the areas of politics, political communications, democracy, and philosophy to talk about the connection between political leadership, trust, and democracy. The conversation you're about to hear was held at the K.C. Irving Centre Auditorium at Acadia and features former Nova Scotia Premier Daryl Dexter, former Nova Scotia Cabinet Minister Kelly Regan, veteran Nova Scotia journalist Steve Murphy, and former Clerk of the Privy Council Michael Wernick. And yours truly was the moderator. Here's the conversation. Thank you, Aaron and Alex, for inviting me to moderate this. And you might not know that this panel is coming after a day of discussions with really the top scholars in Canada. I don't know if you know this, but the top scholars from across Canada are here today who are experts in politics, political communications, and trust. And so it's really been a very stimulating day for me already, and it's just going to get better. So thank you very much, and also to the Jaroslavsky Foundation, which is behind this great event. Thank you, Mayor McKay, for coming. I feel very fortunate that you came, and Jeff Hennessy, the president of Acadia. Nice to meet you. And it's the first time I'm in Wolfville, so I'm kind of like stars in my eye. Like, wow, I was texting my daughter to say that you should come here. She's in grade 12, so she's right at the right age. Mention this is being recorded, so you're on notice. This is such an important topic that we're going to talk about today. And when you think about all the big headwinds that Canada is facing right now, whether it's major global trade upheaval, or it's climate change, or health and housing crises, national security threats. So big changes have to happen. Billions of dollars will need to be spent, big policy moves. I work in the field of public policy. Even if you have the best policy ideas going, the best solutions, the best spending plan, if the public isn't with you and they don't trust you or they don't buy into your plan, it's just not going to work. So the idea of trust and political leadership going hand in hand, I mean, there's no question. So the topic is wonderful that we're going to be discussing today. I wanted to just end my initial remarks by quoting from Brian Mulroney. I had the fortune of listening to him in 2014 at a speech that he gave to the Canada 2020 conference. And he said, leadership is the process not only of foreseeing the need for change, but of making the case for change. Leadership does not consist of imposing unpopular ideas on the public, but of making unpopular ideas acceptable to the nation. This requires a very solid argument for change and a very strong ability to make the argument over and over and over again. And I'm sure you can think of policy issues like that where the public wasn't there. Carbon pricing, there's like a great example right there. So I'm going to stop talking. I think there are three big words in the title of this event. So there's leadership, trust, and democracy. I want to unpack those a little bit. Let's start with leadership. I'm looking at you, Daryl, to start us off. What did you learn about what it means to be a good leader or be an effective leader in your career?
Well, I think there are a number of facets to leadership. You have to start, I think, with transparency. You have to make sure that when you're pursuing any policy idea that the decisions that you are making, the reasons for those are transparent to the public, that they understand the reasons why things are happening, so you have to explain what the challenges are. Secondly, I think you, with respect to any policy idea, you have to be empathetic. You have to ensure that they understand that their voices matter, that you're listening to them. You have to communicate clearly and honestly with people, and I think those are kind of the building blocks of building trust in leadership.
Steve.
Well, I would add to what Daryl has said, that as a spectator and not a participant in the electoral process, that there are actually different and potentially quite contradictory metrics for measuring success in politics. You know, obviously, I've covered leaders who were spectacularly successful at getting elected. They won election after election after election, but didn't necessarily run up a tremendous, let's say, a tremendous book of policy accomplishments, but they were very successful electorally. On the other hand, there were politicians, political leaders who had great policy successes and were able to achieve significant things, but did not have electoral success, at least not enough success to be reelected. And I'm not particularly thinking of your case, Daryl, but I think that you did pursue a fairly progressive agenda as Premier and were not able to be reelected. So I think that we want to look at the metrics for measuring success. And I would say simply this, and this, I hope I'm not preempting something that Michael might want to get to, but he touches on this in his writing, that the most effective leaders are able to successfully blend the political imperative, the need to be elected and to be successful, with their policy objectives. And in my experience, those who were able to do that were quite consistent in doing what Daryl has said, presenting a clear vision, a consistent vision, a clearly articulated vision, and to present it in a style and fashion that is reliable and mindful of the need to deliver on commitments. Because at the end of the process, you are assessed by whether you kept your promises, whether you delivered on your policy imperatives, and of course, that sets up the possibility of being reelected through new commitments. But again, I'd like to defer to a more successful political leader on this, and I sense you want to pass to
Steve,
Kelly.
you're a leader.
Oh, no, I've never been elected to anything.
No.
And let me say before I pass this to my pal Kelly Regan, that back in the days when we were both in short pants and we were much younger, Kelly used to be my producer and director in television, and if you want to talk about trust in a leadership role, let me tell you, I trusted this woman.
Kelly, a lesson through your career could be any point, and I reject the idea that you're not a leader, because we're not just talking about political leadership.
All right, fair enough.
But Kelly, what lesson did you learn about what constitutes good leadership?
I think there's when a new government comes in, there's a lot of hope and promise, and people think that you're going to make a lot of change for the good, and people sort of read into it what they're hoping to see. And with every decision, some of that trust gets chipped away most of the time, because most of the time, you're not doing everything that everybody wants all the time. And because you can't. I mean, you can, but you're going to run into budget problems, et cetera, et cetera. So, I do feel like politicians come in with sort of a trust account, and over time, that does tend to wear away. Things they can do to sort of fill up that trust account, be open and accountable, and I think we've heard other folks talk about that. Be accessible, because if you're viewed as remote, then people don't really feel that they know you. You want to be seen to be listening and sharing people, and that's why I think you see political leaders when there's a natural disaster, when there's a difficult time. The good leaders go out and are the comforter in chief. The ones who are less courageous don't go. And I think, that's not a good thing. Good leaders don't punch down. You don't make fun of disabled reporters, for example, that kind of thing. You always are keenly aware of your position, and that there are people who are having a tougher time. One of the phrases that we often hear as politicians is, well, you're all crooks. or they're all crooks, well, except for my local councillor, mayor, MLA, MP, whatever, and that's because people know that person. So I think in doing all of the things that Steve talked about, you also have to become known to the people that you are serving. And that's how you gain their trust, because they feel like they know you and they can trust you. If they don't know you, it's hard to trust people you don't know.
It's interesting, in our conversations that we had earlier today with some of the scholars that have come to visit, one of them was mentioning some Italian research that talked about 3 components of trust in politicians, and one was authenticity, another was ordinariness, and the other was competence.
Yeah.
It seems to me you're talking about a little bit about ordinariness, which is, you know, I can come and meet you at the farmer's market or at the coffee shop, or, yeah. Michael, how do public servants fit into the question of trust, and what role do they play in
Let's
building?
stay with leadership for
Sure.
a minute, because you know, you can practice leadership running departments and organizations. I had 5,000 employees at one time. You know, people play leadership roles, and I think there are elements of leadership which are relatively common to the private sector, being a university president, running an NGO, and so on. This is clearly going to be one of those panels where we agree with each other far too much, and there's not going to be enough.
We'll see, we'll see.
So
I don't agree with that, Michael.
I agree with, you know, all of my colleagues, but so out of all those things, what I would put at the absolute top of the list is clarity and candor in communications. It's all very much about persuasion, trying to shape and bring public opinion along, or deal with resistance. Anything meaningful in policy and politics is going to be resisted by somebody. So, you know, you're going to have to already map out your strategies for dealing with resistance and the arts of persuasion. So it's so caught up with communications. But I think that's true in other walks of leadership. I think in politics, I would just add one factor, which is decisiveness. Make the decisions, make the call. The enemy of a politician is the hourglass of time running out, and they all write memoirs regretting that they didn't push harder and faster to get things done while they were there. You are at best going to be there. It's a gig job. You're going to be there for a period of time. You have stewardship. You have the levers. You're going to, and you know, make the call that you can. But I think that's true in other walks. I used to, you know, I'd tell my middle managers and you know, tell people, you have more agency and authority than you think you do. Get on with it. Make the calls you can make.
On that decisiveness, what happens when you move fast and you break things?
Yeah.
Does that kind of?
But that's the art, is figuring out how hard you can push before, you know, it becomes a big problem. But big tectonic changes, you know, I think you said this, you know, repetition and persuasion. We moved Canadian public opinion to be basically insisting on balanced budgets, you know, to be pro-free trade, change social attitudes on any number of issues, attitudes towards drunk driving and smoking. Like, values and opinions can be molded and shaped through leadership. It might take repetition, persistence, and it might take, you know, 2 or 3 politicians to, you know, to continue the job that they get from their successors. But that's the call at the cabinet table, or, you know, are we pushing too hard? Is this going to be more pain than it's worth? You know, whether it's what they announced on Canada Post today, or you know, whatever it is. So that sort of balance, saying I need to get things done, but this might be pushing too hard. That's exactly, you know, why they get the big money. No, they don't actually.
Well, it depends on your perspective. Kelly, I'm just going to go back to you. Is there a time when, like, a challenging moment in your career where you were really struggling with trying to maintain trust of your constituents, or on a file that you were working on?
Well, one of the things that one of my portfolios, my last one was Minister of Community Services, and Nova Scotia was the last jurisdiction in the country to actually open up adoption records. And there were good reasons why people were very wary of it. 2 previous governments had actually brought in bills and tried to do it, and it did not go well, and the process stopped. And so it was a process of, getting the okay from caucus and the leader, and then from there, it was a lot of consultation. There were, the reason that things had not gone well previously was that there was still a lot of stigma around having given birth out of wedlock. But I knew from talking to people that attitude was changing, and people didn't, I think some people didn't realize that had changed. So it was a lot of consultation. In addition to doing sort of broad consultations, we also consulted at length with the African Nova Scotian community, which had a different relationship to adoptions. They didn't do them the way that we did, and the Indigenous communities. And so simply by sitting down and talking with people, and then also ensuring that people who had a lot to lose knew that there was an ability to give only so much information. So it was, again, I go back to what I said before about listening and sharing. It was sitting down and really taking into account, and not saying to some 90-year-old woman, well, too bad your information's coming out whether you like it or not. So anyway, we did get it done finally, but we were the last jurisdiction in the country, and it really did take a long time.
Steve, you would have, in the newsroom, you're covering events like this. How did you build trust with your audience? Because you're in another sphere of trust that's very important to what we're talking about.
Well, I think, journalism is under fire for lack of fairness, accuracy, and balance, but I keep going back to those. This is a former journalist. This is a former journalist. There are other former journalists in the room. I don't think that the basic rules of the game have changed. I think that we need to remain firmly and alterably committed to being fair and being accurate and being balanced. Bringing perspective to subjects is very important. That does not involve and should not involve the injection of opinion into reportage. And I am a very, very avid consumer of media of all kinds, and I think many of you are. And I'm greatly distressed when I hear opinions being expressed without the clarity that says this is an opinion. I'm all for opinions in journalism. I'm doing opinion journalism now, and it's disclaimed before I say a word, and I'm very glad it is, because I don't want there to be any confusion in the minds of the people who are listening, reading, or viewing about what is being said and by whom. And the truth is, none of us, those of us who practice journalism, politics, or anything else, none of us are without opinions. I mean, it would be a pretty dull and boring world, and we would be a pretty dull and boring people if we didn't bring opinions to the dinner table. But the point is, my opinions should not go to the news desk. They need to be checked at the door, and we need to be very, very adamant about that in the way that we report and in the way that we separate news reporting from opinion broadcasting, so or opinion reporting of any kind. So I think that is a crucial factor. Another is that, and I spent most of the last 15 years that I was on the air concentrating on interviews, which I did daily in a long form of between 6 and 16 minutes a day. And I think that it is really critical that interviewers in particular bring exactly the same amount of rigor and vigor to all of their interview subjects to the best of our abilities. And I can't sit here and tell you that I always walked the line perfectly, and I was often accused of falling off the line, and I'm not here to defend it. I'm here to tell you I did the best I could. And when we made mistakes, we corrected them. That's the other thing that I think we need to remain firmly committed to on the journalism side. In a world where there is so much information, much of it coming from sources that are not credible, the people who are offering credible information need to be the first to admit when they make a mistake. We should not have to wait to be called out. And I see this happening, and I find it distressing. So to answer your question, I think the bond lies in fairness, accuracy, balance, and accountability. And I think many of the things that we expect of politicians, we bloody well need to expect of ourselves.
Thank you. Daryl, what is the link between trust and democracy, that democracy being the other big word in the title of this event?
Right. Well, I think I think there are really three pillars to trust in democracy. I think, first of all, there has to be a trust in the electoral process. It has to be fair, open, accessible electoral process that people have confidence in. Secondly, I think that there needs to be trust in institutions. So the democratic institutions, whether it's the parliament, legislature, city council, the civil service, there has to be trust at the institutional level. And of course, there has to be trust in leadership for all the reasons that have already been discussed here about how you go about guiding people through what are often kind of complex policy issues. If you do those things, if you have those three pillars of trust, then what you get out of that is you get social engagement, you get a respect for the rule of law, and you get social cohesion. Like, these are the important parts in a democratic society. When you don't have those things, what do you get? You get disengagement, you get polarization, and you get an amazing susceptibility to misinformation. And I think at this point, this particular time in our history, we have seen this. But it's not, I think it's not that we haven't seen it before. Historically, this has been kind of the playbook of failed democracies around the world. But it's just that it's been kind of writ large in the last number of years.
Michael, Daryl mentioned the public service, but talk to me about, you're inside the public service. There's the political class that are working on their end of building trust in institutions, and what does it look like behind the scenes? You were the most senior public servant in the federal government.
Well, I mean, I think public servants and public servants have a role in this sort of reinforcement of trust. I mean, job one is just deliver the best services you can, and in a way which is responsive to citizens. The other is advice to political decision makers, and it's a very special relationship. It's a privilege to be able to work closely with ministers and cabinets and prime ministers as they wrestle with these choices and try to provide the analysis in the background and a nudge here, here and there, and just help them do their job in a democracy. It's a really, really special role, and one which I was privileged to play for a long time. I think that there's, what you see is, I think it was alluded to, in times of crisis when people are anxious, it's often you bring out the sort of reassurances to bring out the white-coated medical officer, or to bring out the emergency management person, or the people dealing with the forest fire and so on. So there's a reassurance role that you're there for, you're there for people, and that's an important thing that people can do. I think that I hope we spend more time on disinformation, because my view is that is the issue, that is the biggest threat, and it's the hardest one to come up with remedies for. But one of the things that the governments can do, public servants can do, is be reservoirs of reliable, factful information. Yes, you're going to have all these other forces to continue, but the reserve currency is you have to provide information, data, science, that people can rely on and trust. And if you lose that trust, if you break your statistical agency or your health data or things like that, you're going to be in trouble. What I've noticed as a trend, I'll finish quickly, is you used to be fairly anonymous. I've lived in Ottawa for more than 40 years, and you could be almost completely anonymous. And that's not true anymore, because what you need to do now in more senior positions is be out there, not just at legislative committees, which I had the pleasure of doing, but you find that a surprising number of people, the Chief Justice, the head of the spy agency, the National Security Advisor, the head of you're out there at speeches, you're at conferences, you're doing stakeholders, you're doing roundtables, like you're putting yourself out there and explaining what you do, why you do it, and taking questions. And I think that's all a positive thing, but it means that the leadership skills now are much more about communications than they would have been 20 years ago, 30 years ago, where you could be fairly anonymous and introverted. There is a price to pay for that, which is if you're out in the public realm, you're exposed to the toxic. And a lot of my colleagues were starting to run into bullying and cyber abuse and even death threats and so on. And you see people being driven out of positions, public health officers and the like. So I don't have an easy solution for that, but that kind of transparency brings with it a cost as well.
I am going to come back to misinformation. One thing I wanted to broach with you is about the things that get in the way of good leadership and building trust. The events get in the way, or factors of the job get in the way. This is a question for Kelly and Daryl. A lot of people in the room here who work in political science or in that area talk about there being a permanent campaign right now. So a lot of times people are in a constant kind of churn to get reelected in the next election, especially in minority contexts. Is it possible to be working on building trust and being a good leader when you have this other pull, which is, go after the other parties, do everything possible to get reelected? The two don't seem to be always working in the same direction. Daryl, go ahead.
Well, we used to call it the toothpaste theory, right? So you have people pushing on both sides, and hopefully the good stuff kind of comes out of the middle. That's why you have an opposition and a government caucus, and why you're bringing forward legislation that's going to be debated, so that there will be that push and pull. That's really the basis of the way that our democracy works. But I would say this, and I used to say this a lot when we were in office, that being here, meaning being in that office, has to be about more than just being here. So you have choices to make when you're in that office, and generally speaking, and I realize that all generalities are, generally speaking, wrong. But governments fall into one of two categories. They're either transformational in nature or they're transactional in nature. And if you're transformational, it's easier to sometimes be transactional than to go the other way around. If you're just constantly transactional, it becomes much more difficult to be transformational. And our perspective was, we came into government at a time, following a great financial crisis, so the levers that we had that we could pull were all on the policy front. So we had major policy initiatives in practically every department in government. And that transformational nature, the downside of that, and this is the politics of it, is that any time you're engaging consistently in kind of transformational policy, that can create confusion in people's minds, and it can create tensions. And it's easy to characterize policies when you're the opposition as having downsides, because frankly they do. So it's always a risk, but you have to ask yourself whether, what kind of government do you want to be? And in our view, we felt that the impact of the changes that we were going to have were of such magnitude and such importance that it was worth, essentially putting the government at risk. There are people who would not do that. And I have to say, I think, quite frankly, transactional governments have a tendency to last longer. And to give you kind of an example from the other side of the aisle, I think the Savage government back in the early 90s was actually a transformational government in many policy areas. So it's not just New Democrats who are transformational, but that's the kind of decisions that you have to make.
In observing other political arenas in Canada or in Nova Scotia, do you see that there's a threat where, if you're in opposition and you're criticizing an institution of government as failed, or major government policy that's failed? We've seen criticism of the Bank of Canada and institutions every once in a while, people will go after the Supreme Court. It's not, it has happened where people have undermined the courts. Is that sort of working against yourselves when you're putting doubt in people's minds about the very institutions that you have to work in yourself?
I don't know if Kelly
You can
wanted to
go
do it, but yes, I think it's important that we instill trust in the institutions we have. I mean, you use the Bank of Canada as an example. The problem for the Bank of Canada is not that they're being criticized, but they only have a limited set of tools that politicians give them to be able to use. If you want the Bank of Canada to do something different than what it's doing, then give them different tools. It's that right now, what do they use? They use interest rate adjustments, which essentially benefit the banks. When there are other tools that you could be using, that the Bank of Canada could be using, that would actually reward ordinary working people rather than big corporations. And I'm sorry if that sounds way too...
Sounds like another panel.
Way too ideological, but it's just true. If you look what happened over the last number of years, I think the rate increases by the Bank of Canada caused significant damage to a lot of households right across this country. That was not necessary and could have been done if the federal government had decided to put in place different economic tools to allow the Bank of Canada to make different choices. They didn't do that. Anyway, another topic for another day.
Kelly, on a kind of related topic of things that sort of get in the way of the pursuit of trust is party discipline, which our friend Alex Marlin does a lot of work on. But from the outside, people can see, and this goes to what you were talking about before about being accessible to constituents and the larger public. But when people from the outside say, well, oh, you're just doing what the leader says or the center. You don't actually have any agency here. You're not representing me. Does that play against trust, do you think?
I'm sure it does for some people. I always knew that if there was something that I was fundamentally opposed to, I had options. And, so if I didn't believe in a piece of legislation or a resolution or whatever, I could walk. I didn't have to stay there. Like, we're all... And I mean, it's a big thing to ask of somebody if it's their job. But I always knew that I didn't have to. Fortunately, I never felt coerced into doing anything I didn't want to do. What I appreciated was that, and I get that this doesn't take place out in public, but if you can have a conversation with your leader, with your colleagues, and come to a decision, I think that's helpful. It's one of the reasons why some of the most successful politicians, and Daryl, I'm thinking about, oh my God, the member for Timberley Prospect, Bill Estabrooks, every Friday afternoon, out knocking on doors, talking to his constituents, knew what they wanted, knew what they thought. It's why, some people, like my husband Jeff, would hold public meetings. I think he was up to 151 when he retired. I did sort of a combination of them both, but if you're going out and talking to people, you're finding out what's on their minds. It makes it easier for you to actually make a decision about what you're going to do. But government is frequently like an iceberg. I was saying to Michael earlier that the public sees this bit above the water, but there's all kinds of things going on. It's not because government's being secretive. There's just a lot of moving parts, and there's a lot of policy A will affect different people different ways, and so there's just a lot of things to consider, and so often people. I remember questioning members of Daryl's government, and I think, why didn't they say this, or this? And then you get into government, right, Ramona, and you discover, they couldn't say that because of this. And so there's just a lot going on, and it's not because people are trying to hide things, but there frequently is a simple answer to every question, and frequently that answer is wrong because it's too darn simple, and life is complex.
Steve, I've had this sort of reflection, and after having left journalism and working a little bit to the side of it in public policy, is whether what we do as journalists overall, the big picture, whether it's actually building trust in institutions. What I mean by that is when we do accountability interviews, which you do a lot of them, or you have a big scoop about a scandal in government, you're doing the kind of investigation that's helping to, reveal what's not good, but is the big picture that you're actually undermining people's trust in government?
Well, let's stipulate that there's a difference between the truth undermining government and damned lies undermining government or anything else. I would say that if in the pursuit of truth and facts and with proper journalism we reveal shortcomings on the part of government, that's fair. But the trouble is, so much of the information, and I'm with Michael on this at the risk of agreeing with you, Michael, that we need to talk about misinformation and disinformation, because those of us who have spent our lives and careers trying to deal with information feel we are drowning in a sea of misinformation and disinformation. And I think we need to be mindful of the fact that what is really eroding a lot of confidence in all institutions is misinformation, disinformation. And the root of that, at least in part, is that I don't know that the average Canadian has an adequate understanding of the way the system is supposed to work. When Kelly says that government is an iceberg, we tend to concentrate on the little tiny piece of it we see and maybe lure ourselves into believing that that's all there is when there is so much more. But in this province, and I stand to be corrected on this unless there's been a sudden change, and I think in most provinces it's entirely possible to graduate from the public school system without being taught anything about what we used to call civics, about the way civil society is managed, about the differentiations among the levels of government. And again, I know you've encouraged us not to be too local and too specific, but I will be for this example. We're having a great debate in Nova Scotia at the moment about the role of municipal government, about the power of municipal government, about whether the mayors should have more executive power and so on. The province of Nova Scotia, which is the senior level of government, is intervening in municipal affairs. But that is the way our system is set up. Now, to Daryl's point, if we don't like it, we can change it. But at the moment, municipal government in this province and in most provinces is the creature of the legislature. So if we are going to have a reasonable debate about municipal power, we need to understand what municipal power is intended to be as it is in the statutes at the moment. And I am convinced that the average working knowledge of government in the country is not adequate to set the stage for a completely coherent debate. It also makes it very, very difficult to separate the information from the disinformation. And those of us, again, who are working in the information business and trying to present properly curated facts, and that includes journalists, scientists, academics, and others, we need to stand up and explain the difference between what you see on TikTok and what you read in the Globe and Mail, because there is a significant difference, and we need to have a very long discussion about that.
Sometimes it's politicians that are going after journalists as mainstream journalists as not credible.
Well, the relationship, I think it was Joe Howe who said words to this effect, that the politician's only natural adversary is the journalist. I'm comfortable with that. No, and I mean that sincerely. I think it's entirely possible, necessary, and desirable for journalists and politicians to clash. And if a politician wants to take a swing at journalism, I think that's fair. Stand up and defend yourself. And as long as you're backed by the facts, good editing, fact-checking, and so on, go for it. And if there's a problem, take it to court. We have remedies that address these things.
As I remember, it was to comfort the afflicted
Well,
and to afflict the
comfortable. Yes, that's
right. The other thing is we should draw a distinction between misinformation and disinformation.
Absolutely right.
Misinformation, probably everybody in the room knows this, but misinformation is the spread of information that is false. It can be done innocently.
Right.
Disinformation is the process of deliberately misleading people with false information, and that's the real cancer that's growing out there these days.
Michael, is there, you were talking about public servants being out more, which is true. There's more desire to understand what's going on behind the scenes. Is there a tipping point between enough transparency, too much transparency around what's going on in government?
Yeah, it's a very good question. We were debating it a bit this afternoon and probably will continue to. I'm sort of a transparency maximalist on sort of the transactions and operational side of government. That you cannot be transparent enough. And you know, I annoy journalists when I point out there's probably more information out there now than in any time in the past. Proactive disclosure of all contracts, all contributions, you know, posting of inspection reports, activity reports. There's a ton of transactional operational information that's there if reporters or parliamentary committees or other people want to use it. I think what I'm more protective of is the deliberative space behind a caucus meeting or a cabinet table where people can disagree with each other and hammer out what they want to do as a team. And I would not want to move, I mean, it's just the only system I really know, so if you move from the sort of the cabinet system where people can argue and change the leader's mind, and I've seen that done, talking a prime minister into something or out of something does happen at caucus meetings and does happen at cabinet meetings. If it works like a municipal council in front of cameras, the candor is lost and the real conversations move to the lobby or some other place and so on. So I'd be a defender of sort of a zone of deliberative discussion that needs to be protected to preserve candor. But everything else, what I said to a parliamentary committee, and they don't like it, is I would extend all of the proactive disclosure obligations that public servants are subject to political staffers. Because when the crap hits the fan and something, you know, a parliamentary committee, a commission of inquiry, or a court digs into it, the digital paper trail of public servants is all there, and suddenly the role of the minister in the minister's office and the prime minister's office is disappeared.
Unless it's in RCMP documents.
Yeah.
Which happens every once in a while. I just want to go down the line just very quickly, and Michael, start with you about the pandemic. So, you know, during the pandemic, you could argue that there was a fair amount of transparency that sometimes didn't work out so well. So don't wear masks. Then, oh, the science changed now, you should wear masks. And then there was some, you know, trust issues that went on with people saying, well, you don't know, you know, you keep changing the goalposts. I'll start with you, Michael, and just go Kelly, Steve, and Daryl. Like, are there some lessons that we learned from the pandemic about building trust and leadership?
Well, I watched the pandemic from home as a, you know, and worrying about my mother, like I was not inside government at the time. I would say that it sort of brings in the reassurance function, you know, after a terrorist attack or a natural disaster or pandemic or whatever, people are looking for some reassurance of a spike in anxiety, and so you cannot communicate enough, and you should be out there and you should be telling people as much as you can and admitting what you don't know. I guess the other lesson of the pandemic is it's easy to look at it in hindsight, but at the time you have imperfect information and you've got to make the decision with very little, you know, and it's this sort of, you have to make the call. And there are issues where, like, the auditors arrive before you've even finished. So, I mean, governments often just have to say, this is the best call I can make with limited information and limited time. And if it doesn't work, they'll change it, you know, and you have to, So, politicians always run the risk of being accused of being flip-floppers, but sometimes changing your mind and changing direction is the right thing to do.
Right, right. They don't often say, I can think of certain people like Ralph Klein or sometimes Doug Ford, who was like, oh, I made a mistake.
Yeah.
Not many politicians actually do that, or say, I didn't have all the information and I've had to, it just is very rare.
But it's very effective. Like, it's very effective to have a certain amount of humility and to not oversell, what you're doing at the time.
Right. Kelly?
I think humility actually is an essential ingredient for success in politics. Because the longer I was in politics, the more I was pretty sure I didn't know everything. When I was in opposition, I was pretty sure I knew everything.
We were pretty sure you knew everything, too.
But I think back to those days, and we were talking about this a little bit at dinner, and, you'd wake up and sigh and think, oh my God, this is not a dream. This is what's actually happening here. And we did not know how lethal COVID was. And people, it's easier to look back now and go, oh, well, we got a vaccine, we got, masking, we got it sorted. Those were very scary days. And, so thank God that our epidemiologists sort of have a playbook for this. And watching it unfold, I think, was very instructional for all of us. I found it very comforting that, initially we had ministers and the Premier and Dr. Strang out, and then the circle got even tighter, and Laurie Graham is here tonight, and she was one of those people in that inner circle looking after Nova Scotia during that very scary time. But it was, and it's a word I hesitate to use, but I'm going to use it anyway, it was almost paternalistic. Stephen came out, well, or Statler and Waldorf, whichever you prefer. But you had Stephen McNeil and Dr. Strang coming out, and in addition to telling you, sort of, these are how many cases we have, this is what's going to happen. And again, remember, everything is complicated, so they would announce something, and then all the MLAs would get calls and say, what do you mean I have to close my daycare? What does this mean for me? How do, where are the healthcare workers going to send their kids? Everything had combinations and permutations, but they talked about caring for other people. They talked about looking out for one another, that we were all in this together. There was a lot of talk of love, and I found that enormously comforting. And I will just say that during that time, Nova Scotia's public service was amazing. And Nova Scotians may never know how amazing they were. My own department, community services, serving some of the most not well-off people in the entire province, people in most need, never shut our offices for a single day. They were open every day they were supposed to be open, every single office. Think about that. You had child welfare workers who had to suddenly, when they were taking children to meet with a parent that they weren't in the custody of. Normally they maybe go to a Tim Hortons and they'd have a little visit there. Well, they couldn't do that anymore, and they became very good at being very creative. And so they would, buy a dining tent, and they put up a tent, and they could go in there and they could have their visit. So I just want to say that it was an amazing time. I think it taught us a lot about what good leadership looks like, and also giving civil servants the tools to do what they needed to do their jobs at an extraordinary time. And I probably talked for too long, but you know what? I really felt very strongly about civil servants that I worked with during that time. They were stunningly amazing. My deputy minister sent an email to our staff every single day, so they knew what was going on.
Steve and Daryl, there was a point, though, where there seemed to be a flip with the public. I live in Ottawa, so you know where I'm going with this. Where there was a lot of trust in government and faith in what was going, and then it just kind of, like about Omicron, remember Omicron? It just went, and people started to get upset and angry with government.
Well, there was extraordinary leadership, and in the beginning, of course, it looked like extraordinary strength and decisiveness and all the qualities that we've been speaking in praise of here. I think it's important for us all to remember, though, that this was a unique circumstance, in that we were not only as a society looking for leadership, we were not only willing to be led, we wanted to be led. We were not resistant in the beginning because none of us knew anything. So we had to rely on those people, and Michael and Kelly have spoken of them, people in the professional public service, people in public health, people like Tony Fauci in our own province, people like Lisa Barrett, and others who distinguished themselves with the clear, consistent confidence they brought to the interpretation of changing facts. So we really wanted to be led to a point. And at some point, and you're absolutely right, Jennifer, the scales tipped, and it went from being led by confident, strong leaders to being told what to do. And it slipped into the area where some felt that perhaps their civil rights were being challenged. I would simply say this: it is regrettable that, owing to the circumstances of the pandemic, that we did not have all of the usual mechanisms of accountability that could be brought to bear. We didn't have question periods. We didn't have as many unilateral interviews with public officials. We didn't have as many questions and follow-ups at news conferences. And we had a case or two or several where certain media outlets were not permitted to take part at all. So all of that set the stage for the kind of suspicion that the conspiracy theorists were just waiting for. But again, I want to reiterate, we wanted strong leadership. And I think in the early days of the pandemic in particular, in praise of almost all of our leadership in the country, we got good leadership, in my estimation.
So I have a little bit of a different take on this. By March of 2022, 37,000 Canadians had died. 90% of them were over the age of 60. Going into the pandemic, we had endured decades of this kind of neoliberalist theory that government was incompetent and incapable of being able to deliver even basic services. And all of a sudden, when the pandemic arose, the governments actually demonstrated that they were capable of putting together global networks, finding a vaccine in record amount of time, getting out extraordinary amounts of money in support for communities across the country, finding protective equipment for healthcare workers. Government responded to prove that all those years of the stuff that we heard about how incompetent government was just simply wrong. And it's not, I shouldn't be lost on anyone that there were lots of elections that actually took place during the pandemic. And every government that went to the polls during the pandemic, the minorities became majorities and majorities were extended. So people rewarded governments at that time for their decisive leadership over the beginning parts of the campaign. Naturally enough, people got tired. It started to wear on them, and there is a natural reaction to that. But I don't think that people necessarily forgot the lessons, as you pointed out, that they wanted to be led, and that governments actually responded in a way that we had not seen governments responded almost since the Second World War. I mean, it was that kind of a response where it was all hands on deck, and government actually served the people in a way that we hadn't had an opportunity to see in the past. I think you should know, people should know, that because of that, there were lots of problems in the way in which the response took place. Different communities had different experiences with the rollout of government programs. I think there are significant issues, in fact, with public health that got papered over because of the strength of the response that need some further work. And this is where I'm going to make a pitch. If you want to read a lot more about this, there's a book called Seized by Uncertainty by my friend Kevin Quigley. It won the Donner Prize this year. It's all about the kind of holes that existed in the response to the COVID-19 strategy, and I was pleased to play a small part in it.
I will make a little plug for IRPP has a report called Resilient Institutions, which is about the pandemic as well. But you bring up a point that I want to, seize on when you're talking about different communities. And there's a serious trust issues, not just the pandemic, but different communities in Canada. Let's take Indigenous people, and obviously, different realities for Inuit people, Métis people, First Nations across the country. But there's serious reasons for distrusting government. There was a heavy lift to explain why vaccines were coming into communities. There were very poor lines of communication with a lot of nations that were interacting with public health. There's many different communities in Canada that didn't have a good starting off point to talk to government on a range of issues. I'm interested in your thoughts about how you account for the lack of trust between political leaders and different communities that haven't had a great experience. I'm looking at you, but anyone can answer that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, all of these things are facts, right? The different communities of interest that exist in this province and across the country have had, very different experiences with their government. When you hear people talk about privilege, that's a real thing. Like, depending on where you were and what your, a lot of us who, even those of us like myself who grew up in a very, very working class family, maybe we didn't start out on third base, but we at least started out on first base, whereas many communities were way further back. There's just an enormous amount of research on how the experiences of communities, whether they are Aboriginal or Indigenous communities or other immigrant communities, how their treatment continues to reverberate not just through their lives, but through generations. And we haven't kind of fully come to terms with that. And we haven't, I think there's a lot of good work underway, but I still think there's a very long way to go in reestablishing, trusted ties with a lot of those communities.
Kelly, do you think it's hard for people to trust the political class when they don't see themselves reflected in the political class or in journalism?
Yeah, sometimes I would meet with people and they'd be talking to me about an issue. Let's say someone in my community rather than as minister, and they're talking to me about a problem they've had or something, and I'd always say, I didn't start here, right? And they didn't know that I'm the first person in my family to go to university. They didn't know that I was widowed at the age of 30. They didn't know sort of my backstory, and I just found when I was really open with them about my struggles too, that they would relax. Because I think some people would come in expecting that they might be judged, and that's not what I was there to do. I will say during the pandemic, I don't think I was responsible for housing at that time, but my department ended up doing a lot of work around that because many of our clients were unhoused, and we learned a lot from that, and we did some things that ensured that people had a place to go, that they had the substances they needed, and that kind of thing during that time that probably at another time wouldn't fly. But we did what we had to do to keep those people safe, and we learned a lot from that. And I think those lessons reverberate today. But it's true. People look at politicians and they think that we were all born on third base, and many of us were not. And I think again, it goes back to people knowing you and feeling like they knowing you and being authentic, because if they think that you are where you are today is where you started out, they may feel judged, they may feel that you have no idea what their life is like. And in fact, many, I would say most of us do.
On the misinformation question, because a lot, there are people that they are gravitating to other voices because they don't feel represented. I'm thinking about, they're the convoy, I don't know how to describe it, but group that was in Ottawa and many people associated across Canada who didn't feel that they were being spoken for. There's a lot of a take-up, I guess, on alternate points of view, whether it's in podcasts or short clips on TikTok or in different kinds of influencers, flat-out misinformation. Steve, what are we to do about this? It's a very complex question that during the pandemic really came to the fore.
Well, I think we have to spend a lot of time thinking about this. I wish I had a lot of clarity and answers. I will say that Noah Yuval Harari has pointed out in Nexus, his latest book, that most of the information in the world is fiction. And he says, and I think there's some simple but profound truth in this, getting to the truth, as opposed to getting to information, getting to the truth requires special efforts through institutions, such as the institution of Acadia University, or the institution of the newsroom, the institution of science, and so on. But I also think it's fair to say that all of our institutions are going to need to start making better special efforts to help our citizens and our fellow Canadians and our fellow global citizens understand the steps we're taking to ascertain the veracity of information. Because information is floating on the top of the water. And again, I'm going to use the analogy of Harari. The truth doesn't rise to the surface. Harari, in fact, says it sinks. So we are the people who have to help the truth come to the surface by supporting it with fact-checking, good research, and I think this is critical, good editing, and full acceptance of authorship. We need to start insisting as consumers of information that we know where it's coming from, who it's coming from, where it's coming from, when it was created. The 5 W's of journalism, who, what, when, where, why. I think consumers of information need to use 5 W's. Who's the author? Where was it written? When was it written? Why was it written? And so on. And I think we, as people who are still, struggling to support our institutions, need to be way more proactive when it comes to pointing out what we do to set our information aside from the mis and disinformation in which we're all swimming.
Michael, you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, a couple. I think the distinction is an important one. Disinformation is purposeful. It's done by somebody for a purpose. It may be vandalism, it may be foreign interference, it may be political agenda, but it has purpose. There are no easy solutions. We could fill 10 conferences on what to do about misinformation and disinformation, but I think that is the issue. I guess what I would say is just dumping more information out there is not going to be the answer. Like, the idea that we will respond to misinformation with just more transparency, I think is like treating a virus with an antibiotic. Like, you will feel better, but it doesn't cure the underlying things. So we have to go right into the diagnostic of where, what are the vectors of disinformation, who's doing it, why, and I agree with all, and create more discernment and more validation and pay a lot more attention to the algorithms and hold the media, social media companies to greater account. Not an easy thing to do, but in a democratic society, balancing free expression and a free media with the state regulating information flows, that is a tricky balancing act to follow. It's easy for an authoritarian government to regulate the internet, not so much for a democratic one. But, I mean, we're in the age of AI. It started years ago. AI is Siri, AI is Google Translate, AI is facial recognition on your phone and so on. And it's a general purpose technology, that's the GPT, just like the internet, just like social media. And it is going to have positive impacts where it's helpful to democracy, and it's going to have corrosive impacts. And so working through, AI is a very, very big part. It's affecting what journalists do, what politicians do, what public servants do, what universities do, and so on. So it is the challenge for this generation.
Are governments on the right channels? Are we, still using a playbook from 20 years ago? No offense to Steve and Kelly and others in journalism, but that, or previously in journalism, but the ship has sort of sailed on traditional mainstream media. My kids saw, unfortunately, a person being murdered, before it was ever on the news. So I don't, I'm not sure if government is playing in the right field anymore. I don't know if you have an opinion on that.
I just think that this is not just the role of governments. It's not just the role of institutions. It's not just the role of information consumers. It's all of us. We all have a role to play. And so, if you see something on the internet, and you say, wow, that's shocking. Okay, who wrote it? When did they write it? Why did they write it? Were they paid to write it?
What's their motive?
What is their motive?
Yeah.
Who benefits from this? Because that's the thing that people often fail to ask is, well, who benefits from me seeing this and me believing this? So I think, there's all that. I think consumers, all of us are consumers of information. We all have to be a little more, I guess, cynical and ask those questions. What's your source? And we all have to be better at sourcing original sources ourselves and to actually go and see them. To me, there is a relationship between this and the scams that everybody is plagued by. And, I just want to say that I've had my information leaked twice now in the last 2 years, and I get, up to 20 calls a day from somebody telling me that, this is compromised and that's compromised, and I don't answer the phone anymore. So if you call me, I'm never answering the phone. So I'll call you back if you leave a message. But I think that we also, as a nation, need to make a concerted effort so that people understand what is disinformation. And in fact, Finland is doing that with school children now, and I think if they're doing it with school children, then we could probably figure out how to do that with adults. Denmark is doing it with university students. I think this is actually the big issue facing us now is disinformation. Because as we all have people we know and love who went down a rabbit hole during COVID, and some people have not come out. And I just think that we have to, as consumers, take those steps. Governments have to take those steps, and we need to teach. And you're perfectly right. I think it was you, Steve, who mentioned it. Civics. Like, oh my gosh. The other day, I'm scrolling away, and I see a picture that says, Canadians over the age of 65 should be concerned about new driving rules. And I'm almost that age, so I thought, oh, let me check this out. But then there's a picture of Mark Carney. Mark Carney has nothing to do with driving rules. It was on my Google feed. And so I took a snapshot of it and I put it up and said, Google, do better. And I think we have to call out stupidity like that. Like, that was just trying to rile people up.
I like to remind people that Google is a search engine, not a research engine. Are you getting tired of having people tell you, I've done my research? And what they mean is, I Googled it.
Yeah.
You know.
No, it's not even Google anymore.
No, okay.
Now it's ChatGPT.
Oh, okay, well, okay, fair enough.
Yes.
Yeah.
Daryl,
I just was going to say that, interestingly enough, earlier Steve mentioned Yuval Harari's book, Nexus, which is a great book. But he rightly says that we should stop calling things artificial intelligence and should start calling them what they are, which is alien intelligence. And because artificial makes things sound, I don't know, somehow benign. Yeah, whereas if you think about it as alien intelligence, it has a completely different kind of gravity to it. So those algorithms that are driving outrage and are designed to do exactly that and to keep you engaged and to keep you outraged, that is a real poison, I think, that many of us, or some of us, because we were older, are perhaps less susceptible to. But I really fear those people who have only ever grown up with that source of information, because they don't really know about, I mean, when I was in high school, I had a Time magazine and Newsweek subscription. So, we had different sources of credible journalism. A lot of people in the current generation don't know anything different than getting everything through social media. So I very much worry about it. I think part of the answer to it is based on community values. And it means that more and more governments have to go into local communities, have to have those kinds of conversations, and make sure they are in fact grounded in those real common community values that we all agree on, rather than kind of these abstractions and outrages that we see so often on social media.
As a whole other very valid conversation, which is around belonging and social cohesion and in communities and what you get from people that are right around you that aren't often, cyberspace, what an old-fashioned word. We have about 10, 12 minutes left, so I wanted to wrap up with some sort of larger questions, hopefully positive ones. Daryl, I'll start with you. If you had to give advice to an incoming premier or minister, MLA, what would you tell them about earning trust, building trust, and leadership?
I think we've really kind of canvassed through a lot of these already, and I said some of them kind of at the beginning, which is that whole, and Michael talked a lot about this, the necessity for transparency in decision-making and in, what challenges you actually find when you get into office, because often, those things are very different than what you would have expected. I mean, Kelly said that, and that idea of being able to admit a mistake. I don't know who said it, somebody said it a long time ago, that consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. If you have more information than you had when you initially said something or postulated something, then you should change your mind. I mean, people generally have two opinions. They have their immediate opinion, the one that when they hear something they react to, and then they have a considered opinion. Once they've had the opportunity to bring in all the information and to look at it and to analyze it, they may come to a very different conclusion than what their immediate opinion was. So I would counsel anyone to be have patience with that process and to be able to admit mistakes. As I said, I think I mentioned at the beginning, just as best you can, clear and honest communications. Again, Kelly mentioned, there are things that you learn when you are in government for privacy reasons, for commercial reasons, that you can't talk about. And, you know, if you ever see somebody standing there in a scrum, you can almost see them, you know, calculating in their head, okay, where is that line where I am no longer able to, you know, kind of say everything I want to say, because there are, potentially I could hurt somebody else, or I could hurt a potential business that might be thinking of working in the province. There's a real calculation that goes on almost every time you answer one of those kinds of questions. I would say, you know, all of those things: transparency, accountability, clear and honest communication, and finally, I think I mentioned this before as well, is just, you know, listen to people, make sure they know that their voices actually do count for something. I mean, trust is a two-way street. If you're asking them to trust you, you've got to be prepared to trust them as well.
Thank you. Steve, what's a change to the newsroom dynamic or the reporter-politician dynamic that could help restore trust in both of those institutions?
Yeah, well, I think I would be remiss if I didn't say that I think that journalism in the country, but even more so than just journalism, I think society needs to come to terms with the fact that at the moment we don't have a very good business model for the support of independent journalism in the country. We've gone from the model of television news, for example, that Laurie Graham and Kelly Regan and I worked in, that was advertiser-supported, driven by large viewing audiences, down now to services that are supported by far fewer advertising dollars. Television advertising is worth far less than it used to be. Many of those eyeballs, by the way, have migrated to online and digital platforms where those dollars are now worth dimes. So we need to find a way to make the collection and reporting of news economically viable. And I'm going to leave any further discussion about the role of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation out, because we don't really have time to get into that, although I would like to. But I would prefer that government not subsidize private media. And I would prefer that for the simple reason enunciated by the great late Liberal rainmaker, Senator Keith Davey, who said that in politics, perception is reality. And there is a perception that the media are too cozy with its funders, and I think we need to resist that. I actually don't think, in fact, I will speak of the journalists I know. I don't think I know any journalists who are on the take for a government subsidy, but I don't know that the public is on board with this idea. So I'd rather find a better way to support journalism. And I don't know exactly where to begin. I do think we need to reconsider the amount of money that is flowing into the coffers of the public broadcaster that might be repurposed into private media, but I don't have a complete prescription for it. But I do know this. One of the first things we need to do if we want to reinstitute or reestablish trust in journalism is give journalism a better foundation. And I'm afraid that at the moment we have far fewer journalists than we used to. I'm very pleased to say we have some great journalists in this country, particularly working in Ottawa. But if you look back over the journalism of the last 10 years, most of the big stories in Canada, I mean the really big ones, have been broken by very few journalists. On the local level, provincially, locally, and I think this is true in almost all of our markets in Canada, we have far fewer journalists than we used to, and we certainly have far fewer political journalists. When I started covering legislatures in Fredericton and Halifax, almost every newsroom in the province, radio, television, and print, was represented in the press gallery. That is no longer the case. The provincial dailies, the Halifax Herald, the New Brunswick Telegraph Journal, the major newspapers from across the country had bureaus on Parliament Hill. That is no longer the case. So much more of our journalism is coming from far fewer people, and that is not healthy for the discourse we need to have to rebuild confidence in journalism and leadership.
Thank you. So Kelly and Michael, we're going to end with you. Is there a solution, a policy tool? Yeah, a framework from inside government or outside government that could move the needle on building public trust.
I would, at the risk of breaking with the utter agreement that we've sort of seen across here, I would disagree with Steve around, not on the issue of the payment, because I'm not sure about that. But I do think the national broadcaster is needed.
Oh, I do too.
Because right now, and needed in a big way, because right now, when at the legislature, when I go there, there's a handful of reporters covering the legislature. When I started covering city halls, when I moved here in 1984, back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, every radio station in town, every paper, all the television stations, they had reporters at City Hall. Every time City Hall had a meeting, or council had a meeting, they covered the legislature. And the legislature currently only sits like 2 weeks in the spring and 2 weeks in the fall. So it's not like it's a huge commitment to actually go and cover the legislature. But we are not seeing the kind, and don't get me wrong, I totally understand the financial constraints that various outlets are under, and so that's my concern. We do not have the scrutiny of the legislature that we used to have. We do not have the scrutiny of councils that we used to have, et cetera, et cetera. We have concentration of our media environment. Most of the newspapers in this country are owned by the parent company of the National Post. That, in turn, is owned by an American hedge fund. We don't have independent journalism in this country anymore. So I think, for me, the CBC is important to push back against that concentration of ownership. So I did want to make that point.
I don't disagree with anything.
Yeah. Oh, darn, now look, here we are. It's 11.
Okay, there was one little thing I did not.
In terms of misinformation, I really do, or disinformation, I really do think that, it's on all of us. But we also have to be concerned about governments failing to give people the information that they're entitled to.
Here, here.
And so, we saw, and sorry, because I'm going to be specific here, we saw a bill that would have allowed the Nova Scotia legislature, with a 2/3 majority, to fire our Auditor General without cause. And this is the kind of thing that you're seeing. So you're seeing power grabs by certain governments, not all governments, certain governments, and that would impede our ability to know what's actually going on. So I think, citizens have to be watching governments on that. Governments have to do a better job and make sure that they're not doing things like that. I think we all have to get familiar with sites like Snopes, or in Canada, Laura. They're named after Laura Secord. How cute is, how wonderful is that we have the ability to have our own. It's not quite Snopes, it's different, but there are ways for citizens to sort of find out the truth when they see something. A few years ago, my mom called me up and she said, I have an email here, one of my friends sent it to me. It says here that most members of Parliament have criminal records. And I said, Mom, that's not true. She said, I know, but I don't know how to prove it. And I said, well, actually, that started off as an email that went around in the US about members of Congress. It wasn't true. It's the exception rather than the rule. And I said, let's go to Snopes, and we looked it all up. But it's giving people, and my mom's 86 now, she would have been probably about 80 then, but it's giving people the tools to look this stuff up and to understand. And I do think that we need to look at some kind of training, like they have in Finland or Denmark, so that young people can learn to identify what's likely not true. Because otherwise, young people, I feel sorry for you in that respect. We grew up with the World Book. We had encyclopedias in our living rooms, right? We could go look stuff up, right? Now everything moves so quickly, and there's so much garbage out there every day. And so, we're all going to have to learn how to detect this stuff better, and it's not easy. And when you find stuff that isn't true, call it out. And when you know they're wrong, call it out and give your source. Because that's the thing. There's often no source for the stuff the junk that you see. Give the source. Direct people to it. Help people along. This is not going to be easy, but I think we have to do it.
All right, Michael, you're the last word. Your suggestion could be on any element of what we've spoken about.
Yeah,
but-
I mean, we shouldn't be looking for one sort of magic wand, single solution. There's going to be pressing on many fronts with many tools against a, big phenomenon. So some of it's in the hands of legislatures. It was a terrible failure of the last parliament not to pass an online harms bill or the AI bill or the data privacy protection bills. They sat in the legislature for 2 years without getting passed. Maybe this parliament can get on with it. It was a failure of the last parliament not to update the 1980s Access to Information Bill. Maybe this parliament can get on with it. So some of it is about the rules and the software and legislative upgrades. I think that what little I know from attending political science conferences and so on about disinformation is there has been some success, not nothing sort of magic, through proactive pre-bunking, they call it, of reliable information. And I was at a meeting of all the election commissioners back in the spring, and I think it was BC that did a very active anticipating the disinformation and pre-bunking information that made it easier for responsible media, if that's anyway, to kind of use and for citizens to use and so on. So I think you can't just sort of be passive, any of us. It requires a more proactive, engagement and sort of battling the dark forces of disinformation every chance you get. Not going to win all the battles, but I think empowering citizens, and I think my little point of disagreement on media is they're really important as being we trust them to hold the political class to account. So trust in the media has its own sort of value in a democracy. I think I agree with you. I don't see the point in subsidizing Postmedia, Torstar, Bell. That is demonstrably undermining trust now because it's giving the populace an argument. But I would keep a space for local media and local journalism and dealing with the news deserts at local and provincial government. And I think there are probably some creative tools to support local journalism. There's really, really good local digital media in my community, and I'm sure that's true in other places. And it's not expensive, so that anything we can do to kind of help at the community level is going to help. Because this is playing out at school boards, city councils, health boards and so on. This is not just the federal, parliament kind of thing. It's going to have to be battled on many, many fronts. I sound a little bit gloomy, but I do think that one of the things about democratic systems is their resilience. And in the end, in very authoritarian regimes have been defeated, have been turned back by citizen power. There are lots of positive stories around the world that there's an inherent thirst for people to have some agency over their lives and over their governments and to seek the truth and so on. And so ultimately, the forces of, democratic society and democratic governance, they have a hard road to, and an arc of history and all that. But they are, on the right side of history.
Well, thank you for ending on that note. I appreciate it. Daryl, Steve, Kelly, Michael, thank you very much for the conversation. It could have gone in many directions, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you.
Oh, well, you're very welcome.
Thank you for tuning in to Futureproofing Canada. I also want to thank our presenting sponsor, BMO Financial Group, for its generous support of this podcast. Our executive producer is Ricardo Montrose. Our production assistants are Elisa Coury and Blair Elliott. The show is mixed and edited by Jackie Gallant, who also does our music. If you liked what you heard and you want to find out more about the IRPP, you can head over to irpp.org, and you can subscribe to our newsletters and check out all our latest publications. And if you really, really like what you heard, leave us a review on your podcast app or share your feedback on social media. You can find us on most platforms at IRPP. For the Institute for Research on Public Policy, I'm Jennifer Ditchburn. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new episode of Futureproofing Canada.